Training camp is underway, and we already have plenty of wide receiver clips inundating the internet. Plus, Brandon Aiyuk wants to be traded. What does this mean for best ball? Stay tuned to find out. Welcome to Summer School Club Fantasy's best ball podcast, streaming exclusively on YouTube. I am your host, Austin Amandolia, and here with me, as always, is Matt Record. Matt, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Excited to talk about wide receivers. I feel like we've reached this pivotal point in fantasy where wide receivers are more important than running backs, and they have been for a minute, but have we gone too far? We'll talk about that.
We are going to talk about that because the wide receiver situation is bonkers this year. The environment it's quite a time out there. Wide receivers are just flying off the board in drafts. But don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you see every episode that comes of this show. By the way, if you've been watching the show, we're switching times, as you will know, because it wasn't at the same time this week. Episodes are now going to air Saturdays at 11 a.m. But don't worry, we still have content coming at you every day, including our mock draft podcast, which is taking over the Friday night slot that this was dropping at. So you've got plenty of content, and I'll talk more about that later. Also, be on the lookout for our cram session episodes where we're going to go through every single game that is happening in week 17 and talk about those matchups. But tonight, we are continuing our position by position breakdown, discussing the strategy behind how we draft each position. As a reminder, if you drop questions in the chat, we will get to them in the following episodes. And tonight, as Matt already alluded to, we're talking about the wide receiver position. We've talked about quarterbacks. We've talked about running backs. We've got some good rules of thumb there. Now it's time to talk about wide receivers, which has somehow become one of the most important positions in best ball, in part because there's so many good wide receivers. But let's start with the basics. Matt, how many wide receivers should you be drafting in best ball leagues?
Sure. So as always, with Everything Fantasy, I'd say check the league settings. How many wide receivers do you have to start? So I'm going to preface my answer with this. So the tournaments that we often talk about require you to start 3 wide receivers, which means you're going to want more of them, and you only have to start 2 running backs. So typically in those leagues, we're talking the puppies of the world and underdog and whatnot. I'm targeting 7 or 8 wide receivers. Some elite options, and then just a whole bunch where you just need one to pop off to fill your spot. But again, I'm in some best ball leagues where you only have to start 2, which kind of changes your strategy drastically.
Yeah, I think that's a really good distinction to make because I'm doing a ton of drafts on like Underdog and DraftKings, and those are always 3 quarterbacks plus a flex position, 3 receivers. Could you imagine a 3 quarterback league? 3 receivers plus a flex position. So you could have up to 4 receivers in your lineup on any given week. And because of that, receivers really get pushed up. But if you're playing in your kind of a home league of sorts or anything like that, it could be different. In those underdog and best ball leagues where you have to start 3 receivers, I'm seeing most people who are successful drafting 7 wide receivers. That is pretty commonly the dominant. Sometimes folks go to 8, but it's interesting. It's definitely most of the time 7 and 8, but last year there was some advantages to having drafted 7 instead of 8, which I find very fascinating. I think that could be a little bit associated with some of the other trends we've talked about so far this year. Right? We talked about quarterbacks last year. It was really advantageous to have 3 quarterbacks in part because of all the injuries. A lot of times, if you have a 3 quarterback build, you might have a 3 tight end build. If you draft, 5 running backs, then there's only 7 positions left. So that's just kind of how the cookie crumbles. So some of this, it might be a little bit noisy from some of the other trends we've talked about so far with the other positions. But to give the numbers, for the entire field of Best Ball Mania 5 drafters last year, 37% of drafters had 7 receivers. Among those teams that advanced to the playoffs, 39% had 7 wide receivers. And lastly, in the final, 43% of finalists had 7 wide receiver builds. So that's kind of the sweet spot. I'm saying around 7 or 8. I'm probably never going to 9. And in fact, there was evidence that if you get up to 9, you're probably hurting yourself in other positions. to a point that it's no longer advantageous. So the field had 9 receivers 11% of the time, finalists had it 7%. So there's a clear disadvantage there. It was possible to make the finals with 5 receiver builds. That feels a little bit sketchy to me, but I'm just saying 2% of finalists made it happen compared to 1% of the field. Technically, that's better, but I don't feel great about it. I'm not doing it myself. So I'm sticking in that 7 to 8 range. But that's kind of like common knowledge at this point. Most people that you're drafting with are going to be aiming for that amount. But when should you be drafting receivers is become the crucial question. And it's particularly interesting this year. So we're going to talk about how many receivers we are drafting by certain rounds. So Matt, do you have a rule of thumb that you want to have a certain number of receivers by a certain round?
Sure. I don't have a rule of thumb because I like to take these draft boards as they come at me. I personally I don't like having I need to go wide receiver, running back. You know, those kind of locked in positions by round, or even yeah, I want a certain number of extra. I see what comes to me, what comes to value. You know, because if you're talking wide receivers or tight ends, sometimes in the third round, like, ooh, look at that. I can grab a Laporta. I can get like potentially the tight end one instead of, the wide receiver. And we'll talk about it like 30, right? You know, stuff like that. With that being said, with the wide receiver being so important, I don't feel comfortable leaving the first 5 rounds without at least 2, I'd say. 2 of the top 20, top 25, and we'll talk about the wide receiver dead zone in a bit, but without people that you feel confident in producing every single week. And of course, it's fantasy. They might not do it every single week, right? But, people you feel confident in, not just, dart throws. So, yeah, 2 or so by round 5. I like to have my top 3, your starting lineup. I feel the most comfortable if I have that built in after the first, I don't know, 6 or 7 rounds.
Yeah, I think that's really smart to think about it differently, like on a case by case basis. Because it's hard to say like every time, like, oh, I'm going 3 wide receivers to start off and then getting my first running back or whatever. Like those rules, the more that you just like sink yourself and dig your heels into like specific strategies every time, the less different you're getting in your lineups and you're missing out on opportunities. Like we don't know if wide receivers are going to continue to be as dominant this year. Last year was a historic low for offenses, right? Like for fantasy offenses. So we don't actually know what's going to happen this year. We're kind of basing things off of recent years. And so, yeah, we may say, I still want to make sure I'm getting elite receivers in the early rounds more often than not, but you should still sprinkle in some other strategies. So there's been times where I've gone like 2 running backs in the first 4 rounds to be like, you know what? Let's see what happens when I have, I don't know, Jahmyr Gibbs and Jonathan Taylor on my team. Like sounds like a really interesting way to get different given the current receiver environment. I also don't have like a super clear rule of thumb, but what I will say is it is very common for folks to definitely get one of your elite receivers in the first 3 rounds. So 91% of the field is getting their first receiver in the first round. And specifically for finalists, it's up to 94%. So it does seem like you need to make sure you have at least an anchor receiver that's going to lock down your team. And I will say, like, it was also like there was an advantage to having your first receiver in the first 2 rounds. Interestingly, finalists who took a receiver in the first round did worse than the field. Like there was a lower proportion of finalists who took a receiver in the first round than the field, but I think that's just because of Christian McCaffrey. Like I think that's literally all that happened there. So that's a little bit noisy, but you do need to probably have a receiver in the first 3 rounds. And then I'm thinking about like, okay, how long does it take me to build out my 3 receivers that I have to start? And very similar to what Matt said, it is common to have 3 receivers by that 5th round. So last year, the field did this 51% of the time. Teams that advanced did it 55% of the time, but finalists did it 66% of the time. So 3 receivers by the 5th round, that's a decent rule of thumb there if you want to go that way. But I'm not doing that every time. I might do that most of the time. I might, get my tight end, particularly Here's why I like this build. It's perfect for the late drop in a quarterback, right? You get your 3 receivers, maybe one of them CD Lamb. You find a tight end and a running back. There's your first 5 rounds, and then around 7, I think that's where Dak Prescott is going, right around there. You drop him in, you got your stat. So if we were to have a rule of thumb, we'd say 3 out of 5. But remember, you want to try some different things here and there. Now, one of the more interesting things about receivers this year that I want to talk about, and Matt, I can't wait to hear your thoughts about, on Underdog Fantasy, 26 of the first 36 picks are wide receivers. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, you mentioned if you want an elite option, you got to take in the first 2 rounds. This is why. Like it's nuts. Like the wide receivers are gone, which is interesting because it poses certain opportunities to if you've watched our running back episode. I keep finding myself doing the running back hero build because you have these awesome running backs surviving longer than you'd think because people are just so worried about grabbing receivers. And we'll talk about sort of the wide receiver dead zone later, but there are so many wide receivers, and at a certain point, it's like, do I feel more confident in this wide receiver on this bad team, or do I feel more confident in this running back? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
However, on Underdog, you have to start 3 wide receivers, so it's very important that you have a solid number there, and it's only a 1 QB best ball, so like obviously QBs aren't going to be there. So how do I feel about it? I suppose it's with the times because offenses have gone so pass heavy. So I guess I kind of get it. But I guess my main takeaway from this is just like, again, don't go with the set plan. See who falls to you and where, because there's never been this many great wide receivers in the league.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And it's interesting because I'm just like looking at the rankings on Underdog right now. I mean, I think there's 14 of the first 15 receivers off the board. Like, I feel fine with having them as my number 1 receiver, right? Like the place where it starts to get gray is like outside of the top 10, you've got Chris Olave. I'm fine with him as my wide receiver 1. Nico Collins, same. Deebo Samuel, I'm a little bit I feel less sure about because he could get hurt. Devontae Adams, though, going in as the 14th overall wide receiver, and then Jalen Waddle as the 15th. Like, you're still getting great receivers, and that's not even to mention like Brandon Aiyuk, Devontae Smith, DK Metcalf, Cooper Kupp. Like, there's so many great receivers in that top 26. So I do feel like we're at a point where there is a possibility where you can get 1 or 2 running backs at the top and still get an elite receiver that's going to be very successful for you. So given that, we have, you alluded to this, Matt, we've talked about the running back dead zone. It's been a very common fantasy discussion over the past several years. I kind of feel like there's a wide receiver dead zone now because of the way that receivers have been pushed up. And I'm curious what you think about that. Do you see a wide receiver dead zone forming? And where would you say that wide receiver dead zone is at?
Sure. For those that haven't watched every episode, when we talk about a dead zone is just, there's a significant drop between the talent between, one player and the next from ADP. So if you don't get someone in the top little spot, there's just a bunch of questions and a bunch of variability with these players. So I'm looking at Underdog's ADP, and for me, the dead zone, and this is crazy, kind of alludes to how deep the wide receiver position is. I see the dead zone at like wide receiver 37. Like, if you're not getting one of those top 36 guys, which again is crazy. Like that's a lot of wide receivers. You're starting to get into the any given week sort of thing. And when I'm looking at this, starting at wide receiver 37 on Underdog right now, you're talking Rashee Rice, Xavier Worthy, the old Kansas City, who knows, Rome Odunze, DeAndre Hopkins, Christian Watson, Deontay Johnson, people like that, where you don't really know, you can't really rely on them for any consistency every given week. Well, we don't know. I would not feel comfortable with relying on them every given week. But right above them, you got like Chris Godwin, Calvin Ridley, Jaden Reed, Keenan Allen, Marquise Brown, like really established names that you feel, you don't want them to be your wide receiver 1, but if you're asking them to be your wide receiver 3, you're feeling pretty decent about it. So So yeah, when we're talking about those rounds and sort of like the tiers of players, I don't want to be drafting my wide receiver 3 in that like, oh, I need to rely on Christian Watson territory. Like, because yes, I'm sure Fawn Packers offense that he's going to have certain weeks that he's going to be great, but he's not going to carry my team necessarily to victory every single week.
Yeah, I'm totally with you there. I almost think that I feel like there's like a mini dead zone a little bit before then. And I think it's just because I don't like this player for fantasy football this year. The wide receiver 26 range, really, I struggle with that. Zay Flowers, having to take him in towards the end of the third round, that is bonkers to me. I cannot get on board with that. And there's some guys behind him that I would rather have. So, but there's still like a lot of question marks there, right? Like George Pickens. How is Pittsburgh going to look with Arthur Smith there and with some combination of Justin Fields and Russell Wilson? Amari Cooper. Is Deshaun Watson going to throw the ball again? Is he going to be decent? Christian Kirk. I think he could be good again, but was that first season with Jacksonville an outlier and we're just waiting for that to happen and it's never coming back? I don't know. Terry McLaurin, he's got a rookie quarterback. Like there's a lot of question marks in this range. But then you get Keenan Allen as the wide receiver 33. Like what's happening there? I don't understand that. And Chris Godwin, you mentioned him, wide receiver 36. So I see a lot of value in certain elements and certain places in the wide receiver rankings this year because of just the overall environment. But I agree. Once you get to that wide receiver 37 range, there are so many more questions than even the ones I just raised. It gets pretty wild pretty quickly, and I've almost found myself inclined to hit receiver early and then wait, fill out the rest of my bench, and then get some cheaper receivers later on. So the dead zone, it might be a little bit based on your opinion and your player takes, but I think right around after you get outside of the top 36, there is a little bit of dead zone of receivers that might be a great time to pivot. But when we're looking at receivers that we're drafting, what types of receivers are you targeting? Are you going for just the down the field threats? Are you going for the target hogs? Who are you looking at in best ball drafts?
Yeah, it'll depend for me on when I'm drafting them. So once I fill out my starting folks, I like to go for those big boomer bust, like the big play ones. There's no reason in best ball to play it safe once you get to your bench, right? Like you're not talking like, oh, I need to get someone that's going to get 6 receptions for 40 yards because they're going to score, 7 points. Like that's not helpful in best ball, especially when you drafted sort of your top 3 people. So I like to go for the big boomer bust play because really all you're asking your bench players, if you got it right, which you have to assume you got your starters right, all you're asking for is 1 or 2 weeks where they go off, right? So you don't need them to be consistent. You just need them to go off 1 or 2 weeks. So I for the first ones, my starters, I like the safer picks. Like, yep, they're going to get a whole bunch of attention. They get a bunch of balls. They're going to, they'll be scoring points regularly, right? But then the longer the draft goes, I go for the big boomer bust guys.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way to approach it. I think too, it does depend a little bit on league settings. So this is where one of the biggest differences to notice from Underdog and DraftKings is Underdog is a half PPR site. DraftKings is a full PPR site. And so that does change the types of receivers I will actually target on both of those websites. On Underdog, I'm looking for receivers that are they're going to get a lot of attention, but they're going to get a lot of yards and they're going to have touchdown opportunities. And then, I want those high ceiling guys later on in drafts, like Jameson Williams. I actually really like him in best ball this year because he's falling and he's got some upside there. On DraftKings, I might go a little bit more towards guys that I think can hit the PPR ceiling. Maybe they get a 100-yard game here and there, and you get 3 bonus points for that. DraftKings scoring is just kind of fundamentally different from Underdog in many ways, so you do have to think about it differently. But overall, I want some stability, but I also want some guys that I think can shoot the moon on any given week, which is a very similar approach to what we take on DFS lineups. So just reviewing what we've talked about, we're looking at how many receivers you should draft. 7 to 8 is pretty common. 7 seems to have been the most advantageous last year. when we're looking at number of receivers by a given round, I think 2 to 3 before round 5 is a safe bet to make sure you're getting those elite receivers that can kind of anchor your team. And then overall, just be aware there are some receiver dead zones. There's a lot of uncertainty in the receiver position this year, particularly once you get outside of the top 36. And then with the receivers you're targeting, have a good balance. Have some guys that are going to produce for your team every week, because having a zero from a receiver or any player is going to kill your lineup. And then find some guys with some high upside. That's kind of the way you can balance this out. So next, we're going to talk some off-season narratives, and boy, are they coming in left and right. So as I alluded to earlier, training camp has started. And I think it was like the first day of training camp. At least it was the first day that I was like, oh yeah, training camp. We get this video of Patrick Mahomes making an incredible throw, by the way, like turning his hips, crossbody, all this stuff. 60 yards down the field to Xavier Worthy in the end zone. I couldn't even tell if there was defense on the field, frankly. I don't know how many defenders there were on the field at the time, but this started the hype train again. We're saying, we're going to see this throughout the season. Lots of deep bombs to Xavier Worthy. Matt, how are you feeling about this? Is this changing how you're drafting Xavier Worthy?
Candidly, no. No. I mean, a lot of training camp's exciting, especially right now. There's no pads. So the speed players often look fantastic when there's no pads and there's no hitting. They just look awesome. So it's nice to see Worthy out there. Obviously, he's a fascinating wide receiver, just with how fast he is, and that there's plenty of opportunity on that offense to be fantasy worthy. So it's not changing how I'm drafting Worthy so much as just remember, just temper expectations. Like don't read the hype too much, because who knows what happens. But where Worthy's going, where is he going? Like wide receiver, I just said I'm in the dead zone, right? So 37,
yeah, he's in that
30,
dead zone.
38. 37, 38. That still feels right, because he's going to have boomer bust weeks with that offense. Like Mahomes spreads the ball around, but it is nice to see. It's just fun to see him do what we think he can do, even if it's just in practice, where it's like, stretch the field. And I imagine there'll be a few weeks where he has pretty long touchdowns.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's changing how I'm drafting him in most drafts. What I will say is it did remind me to check my exposures and to think, have I taken any Xavier Worthy? Am I going to get to benefit from this if he does pop off? And have I taken as much of this Kansas City offense as I think I should have this year? Because the offense was rough last year. I think they're in for a bounce back. And so I did check my exposures, and I had not taken Patrick Mahomes yet, which is kind of wild to think that you would not draft Patrick Mahomes in fantasy football plus Travis Kelce. So I did go do a draft, and I got a Mahomes, Kelce, Worthy stack. And I was like, you know what? Let's ride. Let's see how it goes. Like, this could be the year. So again, it might be like, yes, I want to make sure I have some exposure to that, but I'm not going to start all of a sudden drafting Xavier Worthy every time that I go into a draft. What I will say about those ADPs you just listed, Matt, Xavier Worthy is currently the cheapest receiver of the three main receivers in Kansas City. So I do kind of like getting the value there of saying, like, this is the cheapest guy, and he has probably the highest ceiling of the three. Like Rashee Rice, probably getting suspended. Hollywood Brown, he could maybe stretch the field. We've seen him get really open, but then not catch balls. So I'm a little bit like, I don't know about that. I don't know about taking him as the first receiver overall in Kansas City. So Xavier Worthy kind of showing some value there. But again, I don't think we should all of a sudden start shooting his ADP up draft boards. Next offseason narrative, and this one happened, I think, just before training camp started. Very interesting one. Brandon Aiyuk requested a trade away from the San Francisco 49ers. Interestingly, there's a lot of problems in San Francisco right now, by the way, because I saw Trent Williams is holding out of camp right now for a contract extension. So they got some serious money issues to work out. But Brandon Aiyuk wants out of San Francisco. Does this change how you are drafting Brandon Aiyuk for the meantime?
So doesn't change it because I was already fading him. So last year I was super high on Aiyuk where he was being drafted. He was one of those guys that's being drafted in the 20s or so, 20 to 30 range. That I was like, he has top 15 potential. And my goodness, he crushed it last year. It was incredible, right? So now naturally we overreact. We're not overreact. We react to that as fantasy football players. And now he's being drafted. Where is he being drafted? I would guess top 15.
He is the wide receiver
16. Close enough. Yeah, close enough. Which is awesome. However, a lot of things need to go right for him to repeat that top 15 performance, right? So the Niners have already drafted Ricky Pearsall right there in the first round. George Kittle is in theory going to bounce back year. He'll be healthier. You still got McCaffrey, obviously vulturing a whole bunch of things. So it's like I was already fading Aiyuk in the sense of like, oh, am I drafting him at 15, 16 to get that top 15, 16 output? I feel like he's not going to do that. So I was already fading him. Now the fact that he's requested a trade, it's murky. You don't know where he's going to go. Sure, there are certain landing spots where maybe his value is still decent, but would he be a top 15, top 16 guy? I don't know. So I'll let someone else deal with that. Like I'll take my chances on like a Ricky Pearsall way at the end of drafts where it's like, oh, maybe he becomes the wide receiver too there in San Francisco. Who knows? But yeah, so I was fading him out. How have you been handling Aiyuk?
Yeah, I think I've been in a very similar boat because so first off, let's just talk about how the ADP landscape has shifted on Brandon Aiyuk. He was going around 18th overall earlier this year, and Deebo Samuel was going around 21st overall. They have now swapped. So Deebo Samuel is not going ahead of Brandon Aiyuk, and I've had an issue tapping draft on either one of these players because Deebo Samuel feels like he's on and off the field all the time. Like he's dealt with injuries a lot over the past couple of seasons. So I don't fully trust the production I'm going to get out of him consistently. And Brandon Aiyuk, there's just so much uncertainty there. And to your point, there's so much competition for touches. And I don't like taking him as early as he's having to go. I think he's a fantastic NFL player. From a fantasy perspective, I'm less certain on him. I rather would take George Kittle, who's going as like the tight end 7, and I think like the 6th round ish. Like there's so much more value there. George Kittle had the most receiving yards of any tight end last year. And so I'd much rather just get the value there and then maybe take a dart throw on a Ricky Pearsall later. So I'm with you there, Matt. Now, I do think if you are in on Brandon Aiyuk, the player, and you think he's a good fantasy asset, now's the time to get him because his ADP is going to continue to fall until maybe a trade comes through, which I don't think he's going to get traded. I think, San Francisco's going to say, okay, cool. I'm glad you requested a trade, but you're playing for us this year. So I think his ADP is just going to continue to fall until a trade might happen. And at that point, it's going to start to be hard to get him because wherever he goes, it's going to be a team that's like needing a wide receiver 1, which he could fill. So now is the time, I think, to be in on Aiyuk before any of that news potentially comes through. So last segment, we have listener questions. We have one question from our buddy Joel at the Joel Worth, who hosts our Dynasty After Party podcast. He asked, what draft slots do you like this year and which do you not like? Now, I have some thoughts about this. Matt, what about you? Let's start with which ones you don't like. Let's start with the negative. What draft slots do you not like this year?
Sure. So I associate the draft slot with sort of your starting build, like your first 3 rounds. Like which elite players are you building around? Like which players are available to you in your draft slot. So much like we're talking about wide receiver dead zones, I don't love the middle, the middle of the draft. So we're talking like picks 4 through 7. I can't give really any specific examples of it, but I find like the top 3 people for me are pretty set. Like, you're getting, and then sort of after the first 3, it gets a little murky where it's like, oh, who do I go? I have many different options that I can go with. versus I kind of like it's easy, of course. It's easier where it's like, okay, cool, it's obvious who I'm taking. Like, so at the end of the draft, it's like, okay, who's gonna fall to me? Is it gonna be, you know, the Brees Hall of the world, or for some reason is there like Justin Jefferson still there, you know, at the end of the first round? So personally, I don't like where I have options, because then I can be wrong. I don't like being wrong. I like it being like, of course I'm taking this person, and then be done with it.
Yeah, I hear that. You know, now that you say that, I don't think I've drafted a ton from like the 5 to 7 range. I feel like
Hmm.
every draft I've had, it's either been like the first 4 picks or the last 3 picks of each round, which has been a really fun sort of journey. Um, I think for me, I just like the second and third overall picks this year because Matt, I don't know if you know this about me. I like to be a little bit contrarian, which is why I like best ball and DFS. And I just I can't get with CD Lamb being the wide receiver 1 overall this year. I don't know why. I feel uncomfortable with it. And you know, my brain says Tyreek Hill should be the wide receiver 1 this year, but my gut says this is his last season and he's getting older and could get hurt. And then I'm like, okay, well, Justin Jefferson was the wide receiver 1. He was the number 1 overall pick last year. It should be Justin Jefferson. But who's throwing in the dang ball? And then I'm like, well, there's Jamar Chase, but what is up with Joe Burrow's hand? Like, is his hand okay?
And his hair.
So, and his hair. So it's just that's a really tough spot for me to be like, let me break a tie between the 4 best receivers in the league right now. Like, how do I do that? So fortunately, I've had enough of those draft slots that I've gotten to sprinkle in a little bit of different action here and there. Just worked out. And you should take that approach. But it is a very uncomfortable spot for me to be drafting from. So we got the bad part out of the way. What's your favorite spot to be drafting from this year, Matt?
Yeah, so basically the inverse, right? Like I love drafting first when you get it, which is random, because having any share of Christian McCaffrey feels like a cheat code. Like you feel super good there at the running back spot. But I've also really enjoyed pick 11, 11 of 12. I don't know why. I like the players that are available there, as well as, you know, the quick turn from, you know, 12, 13, and then, you know, you're drafting again at pick 14, because you get 2 really, really good players. Because as you mentioned, or as we've been talking about, there's a billion awesome wide receivers, and some really, really good running backs that are just not being taken after McCaffrey. So I find in like pick 11 or so, I end up with like a Brees Hall. Who would be around there? Yeah, like a Brees Hall. I don't know, Marvin Harrison Jr. or Brees Hall, Drake London sort of build. And I feel really good about the start of my running backs and my wide receivers in that spot. So yeah, I either first, because you feel really good when you have McCaffrey, or towards the end.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same. I love that first pick, just getting Christian McCaffrey and not thinking about it. I love the ends. There's a lot of interesting ways you could build it. You can say I want to get an anchor running back like a Jameer Gibbs, maybe a Jonathan Taylor. If you're betting on kind of a bounce back year from him, if Brees Hall falls, then that's great. But you can get kind of one of those 2 guys. And then I love the receiver option here. I feel like you're getting a bunch of receivers who are currently being drafted at their floor, like Garrett Wilson, Marvin Harrison, Drake London, Chris Olave, Nico Collins. All those guys I feel like can outperform their ADP. And I enjoy being able to potentially even get 2 of those, you know, and maybe Puka Nakua falls in one of those, you know, late round draft slots, and you can get Puka Nakua, pair him with Marvin Harrison. And there you go. You have some week 17 correlation between the LA Rams and the Arizona Cardinals. Like that just feels really great to me. And the other thing I like, this is kind of a subtlety about some of the players going at the end of the first round. A lot of their quarterbacks are going in later rounds. And so when you're in that spot, you can kind of get that elite receiver and not worry about the quarterback you want to stack them with until later on in the draft so you can fill out the rest of your room. So I'm with you on those draft slots. Love taking Christian McCaffrey with the 1, but love being at the end. Now, that is going to be all for this week. Before you go, don't forget to hit subscribe, turn on those notifications, follow Club Fantasy FFL on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. We go live every day. If you're looking to practice what we discuss during this show, don't forget to check out our masterclass Best Ball podcast on Tuesdays at 8:30 with Stacey Perez and Gator J, where they do best ball drafts every Tuesday. We have dynasty shows happening on Sundays, Thursdays. We have mock drafts happening Mondays, Thursdays, and Fridays now. And our DFS golf show post on Tuesday. And of course, our flagship show, no pun intended, airs on Wednesday nights. And when the season starts, don't forget that our DFS podcast will return. So you need to be following us. But for Matt Record, I'm Austin Amandolia. This has been Summer School. And until next time, remember, defense wins championships, offense wins fantasy football, and best ball wins money. See you next time.